My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. Today I'm going to be revisiting the abduction of Muriel McKay, who was married to Alec McKay. Alec McKay was number 2 to the press baron Rupert Murdoch, who previously purchased News of the World. What had happened was that Mrs. McKay was taken from her home in Arthur Road in Wimbledon. And the sad thing is that her body has never been found to this day, despite 2 men being convicted of her murder. I'm looking forward to speaking to Peter Rimmer. He's the only officer left who was on the Muriel McKay case from the first day until the conviction of the Hussein brothers.
Hello, Peter Rimmer.
Oh, hi, Peter Rimmer. It's Jackie Molton, one of your ex-colleagues from the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, hello, Jackie.
I'd be very interested to speak to you, Peter, because you are the last remaining officer alive, I think, who was on the Muriel McKay case way back in 1969, from the first day of the investigation until its conclusion when the Hussein brothers were convicted of her murder.
That's correct, and sadly that is correct that I am the last one, yes.
I wondered if you would be so kind, Peter, that I could come and see you to discuss your involvement throughout the whole of that case.
Oh yes, there's no problem there. I look forward to meeting you.
And you, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
The kidnap occurred on the 29th of December, post-Christmas, awaiting, New Year. They were originally from Scotland, so I'm sure would have enjoyed celebrating the New Year. And she was at home waiting for her husband to come home for dinner. The dog was sitting by the fire. It was all warm and cosy, and her world changed in a second. It was the first time in British crime history that the police ever had to deal with a kidnap. This case remains largely forgotten, but why? It had all the intrigue and the plot that could be taken straight from a thriller.
Mr. McKay came home last night expecting to meet his wife, who should have been indoors. The doors were open. His wife wasn't there. Their shoes were on the stairs, going out shoes. If she'd have been walking out, she would have been wearing these shoes. But her driving shoes are missing, and the car is in the car park.
I've been trained as a hostage negotiator, so I knew that was one of the hardest courses, in fact, that I'd ever been on in my service, because it is dealing with people who are on the edge. They're making these demands of the police. And the police weren't quite sure initially what they were dealing with. Peter, we've come back to Arthur Road in Wimbledon.
Yes.
The house is behind us.
Yeah.
Has it changed much?
Hardly at all. It's poignant to be back here after such a long time. The house is the same and the fence even looks the same. It's almost as it was 50 years ago.
Because one of the things we mustn't forget about this case is that Mrs. McKay was mistaken for Mrs. Murdoch.
Exactly that. They thought they were following Rupert Murdoch's wife. They'd gone back to Australia for Christmas, and that's why why the family had the car.
So when you came to the house, was your job to be with McKays when waiting for the call to come through to monitor it?
We were waiting for any contact from the people who had taken her, whether it be in a letter or by telephone.
How had they got Mrs. McKay to open up the front door?
That is something we don't know. There was no evidence of actual force used on the outer door, the first front door. But then again, of course, they left such a obvious crime in there.
The
Yes.
unprofessionalism of it, because they left so many clues.
Yes. Could you imagine in this modern day, with what we know now about DNA, what would have been in that house?
Exactly. Would have been found them in 2 minutes. But to put it again in context, so it was the time then, there was a lot of publicity about Mr. Murdoch purchasing, you know, the News of the World Sun.
Yes.
This would be an opportunity to kidnap the wife.
Yes.
Based on the information that Murdoch was extremely wealthy.
Yes, and I remember that they asked for it in relatively small denominations. I think it was fives
And tens.
and tens.
Because they asked for £1 million and then
Yes.
they broke it down
Yes.
to 2 suitcases with 500,000 in each.
What they didn't realise how big and how heavy that amount of money was.
The uneasy relationship that exists between the police and the press undoubtedly hindered this particular investigation, but no one could have foreseen what happened next. The McKay family were about to place themselves centre stage in the world's spotlight in a bid to get Muriel McKay back. This is an interview recorded at the time.
And it must be a crank, because to ask £1 million ransom is just incredible anyway. And my mother hasn't any enemies.
She's happily married?
Very happy. We're a very happy family and always have been. And, well, there's no reason. It's incredible.
I'm en route to meet a former Fleet Street journalist who knows the story well and how the press itself made headlines for the way this story unfolded. Robin Gerossi, you're a journalist, and I want to talk to you about the Muriel McKay case. The McKay family thought that if they could use their own newspaper, so to speak, as a way of getting the story out, that would help the investigation.
Yes. I mean, it was difficult for the police in one sense because normally if somebody had been kidnapped, the family would just say, you're the police, you know what you're doing, please just lead us along in this. But in this case, it was a press baron, or certainly his right-hand man, and he wanted to actually play some active part in what was happening. I think the police were rather surprised when they turned up and they started to gather at the Wimbledon home. They were rather surprised to find that the Sun editor, Larry Lamb, was already there with a photographer and a reporter. So the press were involved from the word go. And the problem that created immediately was that at 1:15, when the first call came in from the kidnappers, the police were immediately questioning whether it was genuine or not, because they knew that the media had already started to put the story out. So was this first phone call a genuine call, or was it a crank call or a prank or hoaxers? Immediately it starts creating problems for the police.
Well, it changes the dynamic of the investigation. And what I mean about that, Robin, is the dynamics is that the police are the experts, the police are the investigators.
Yeah.
And it seems that in this particular case, you know, the press, it's the, you know, tail wagging the dog.
Yeah.
That the police are responding to information that's been fed to the press, because normally one wouldn't feed the press in any story in relation to a kidnap, because it is about the urgency in getting back Mrs. McKay.
Yeah. I think part of the problem was, of course, that this was a completely new area, wasn't it? I don't think anyone in this country, press or police, were used to dealing with these kind of abductions for ransoms. And there wasn't a kind of way of doing it at that time. And it wasn't helped by the fact, of course, that Alec Mackay was a senior newspaper executive. So it was a bad mix. And it created a lot of problems for the police, without doubt.
Appeal to you who contact me by telephone, letter or telegram. My son or sons-in-law are ready to meet you or any intermediary anywhere on my behalf.
One man who remembers the extraordinary public broadcast made by Mr. Mackay to the kidnapper was a detective who was fresh on the job. He also remembers an extraordinary twist in the investigation when some help came along that was truly out of this world. David Bowen, in 1969, you were a trainee detective constable within the Metropolitan Police, and you were seconded to the incident room regarding the case of Muriel McKay.
Yes, that's right.
Do you think that the involvement with the press had any implications for the investigation?
It really did hamper the case, hampered the investigation. The fact that he'd gone on the news asking for all that help, because the telephones in the incident room, they didn't stop ringing, and we had to record the names and addresses of the people who were ringing in and briefly what the information was that they were giving us. And of course, eventually all of that had to be investigated, all of those calls, and eventually there was information came in from a medium. And of course, the medium came in and pinpointed a farm in Essex and said that Mrs. Mackay was being held at that farm in a green shed behind the farmhouse, and that there was a stream going along, winding down the hill behind the farmhouse. So we went out there at 2 o'clock in the morning one night and had a look around, searched around, couldn't find any trace or anything like that, no evidence whatsoever. And then it was quite strange that eventually, when the Hussein brothers were arrested, that was at Rook's farm, but this was in Hertfordshire. And I believe that there's a green kennel behind the farmhouse, and there was again a stream wending its way at the bottom of the hill behind the farmhouse.
Did you get a sense that the police were leading the investigation? Initially,
I think that the media had taken over the investigation, but very quickly after that, the police took charge of the investigation, and it was run on their lines.
For the police to seize full control of the investigation was the only hope Mrs. Mackay ever had of being found alive. But the clock was ticking. I'm en route to meet a detective who knows all about the golden hours that follow a crime, especially a kidnap. Lessons were being learned from the off on this case. Roy, you're a very experienced retired detective now. In your experience within kidnap inquiries, for example, what's the procedure with police and the media?
Almost like a murder, those first 24, 48 hours are critical. You really don't want to go wide in those early hours. The Mackay case could have been a watershed. It alerted the police that they needed to have an arrangement which in effect formed a partnership with the press. And so there was a protocol established, certainly during the 90s, where if a life was at risk, and that's a key element, you could ask the editors to hold back.
But things had progressed too quickly in the case of Mrs. Mackay. It was too late to hold back. All the police could do now was to press on and try to find out where she was being held and what exactly had happened to her. The kidnapping of Muriel McKay was one of the news sensations of the 1960s. It was a case of mistaken identity. The incident room was the hub where all potential leads about Mrs. Mackay's whereabouts were being fed, be they real or imagined, from prank callers or letter writers. I'm en route to meet a man who found himself being given a baptism by fire on the job when he found himself working in the Mackay incident room. Peter, what was it like then for you as a trainee detective in the incident room?
We had so many inquiries to follow up through the action books, as it were, that it was non-stop. Mm-hmm. The pressure was enormous.
Were you involved with the Mackay family at all?
I was one of the officers who spent sometimes days with them. It's a very difficult time to be with anybody in those circumstances, because we were there with a family who were grieving, hoping that their mother was coming back, and at the same time we were all waiting for messages or telephone calls from the people who had her.
It seemed to me that there was quite a distance between the ransom calls and the subsequent ransom calls.
That caused a lot of problems because we were forever waiting for contact from them. And of course it didn't come at some times for about a week or more.
Did the atmosphere change when the first letter came through?
That changed everything, because then the reality hit home that she had actually been abducted.
Darling Alec, I am deteriorating in health and spirits. Please cooperate. Excuse the writing. I'm blindfolded and cold.
Yeah.
Please keep the police out of this. If you want to see me, Muriel.
Yeah.
That's very chilling.
It is. And of course this is what convicted them of murder. This is one of the main reasons why they were convicted without a body, because that says it all.
The second letter, I understand, was sent by Mrs. McKay to her daughter Diane. Dearest Diane, I heard you on TV, which still indicates that she's blindfolded. She didn't see her, but she heard her daughter's voice. Would you please persuade Daddy to cooperate with M3 gang? They will telephone you giving that code, number M3.
Yeah.
You will then be sure you are speaking to the right party. Act quickly for my sake, dear. Please keep police out of it if you want to see me again. Act discreetly, as the gang is too large to fall. All my love to you all, Mum.
Yeah.
You know, it's very, very sad.
Brilliant.
And I think this thing, again, about the gang being, you know, quite large, M3 mafia, they're trying to indicate that it's not two brothers in a farmhouse in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
Hearing this whole desperation of Mrs. McKay. It's just beyond thinking, isn't it, what another human being does to another human being, and the pure, you know, desperation. She's lost, she's bewildered, she doesn't know where she is, she's blindfolded, she's cold. And I think, Peter, when you actually see the letter, see Mrs. McKay's own handwriting, that you feel the desperation within the letter, that makes it even more chilling.
Yes, it does.
Than it is. It brings it all home, makes it more real.
Yes.
The letters written by Mrs. McKay were haunting, not knowing whether she would live or die.
Hello?
Oh, hi, Roger Street, ex-commander from the Metropolitan Police. It's Jackie Molton, former colleague of yours. I wondered if you would be prepared to talk to me, Roger, about your involvement as an investigator on the Muriel McKay case way back in 1969.
Well, hello, Jackie. Yes, I'd be very pleased to.
I need to know more about how this drama unfolded once the letter from Mrs. McKay had been received.
The statement from Mr. McKay says, would you please inform me what I have to do to get my wife back? What do you want from me? I'm willing to do anything within reason to get my wife back. Please give me your instructions and what guarantee I have that she will be safely returned to me.
I'm going to speak to the detective who became involved in the bid to get Mrs. McKay back with a ransom drop. On the 1st of February, instructions were received for Ian, the McKay's son, to bring £500,000 up the A10 to High Cross in Hertfordshire. But Ian McKay wouldn't be in the car. His place was to be taken by Detective Sergeant Roger Street.
Because I was thought to look something like Ian McKay, the boss said to me, he said, we've got a job for you. We want you to impersonate Ian McKay and go and meet the kidnappers.
And what did you feel about that?
Well, I was a young detective sergeant. I mean, I thought I was invincible. I thought that was going to be very exciting and something I'd really enjoyed doing, yeah.
So the instructions that you got, can you remember what they were?
We were told to go to certain places. I remember one was a telephone kiosk. I went in and there was a note there and it said drive off to another location, to another village further up towards, into Hertfordshire, and it said that there would be a grass bank at this junction in the road where there would be some white flowers, imitation flowers put on the side of the road. And when we got there, sure enough, there were. We were told that I would have to leave the suitcase with the money in it, buy the white flowers, and then to clear off. We went off somewhere else, somewhere away from the scene, and waited there until we heard that the money hadn't been collected because something had obviously gone wrong, and so we drove back and we picked the money up.
How did you feel then when you the bag's not picked up and it's going to be a no-no and you have to go back and get the bag?
Well, it was frustrating and disappointing. I mean, we as I said, we set off with high hopes, and unfortunately it came to nothing. In retrospect, looking at it, with the benefit of all the things that you have at hand nowadays, 50 years on, you realise just how under-provided for we were as an investigation team.
Also pulled in on this first unsuccessful drop was my old team, the Flying Squad. Tony Stevens, in 1969, you were a detective sergeant on the famous and elite flying squad within the Metropolitan Police.
Yes.
So how come the flying squad were involved in this?
Well, there was only one flying squad vehicle involved in it, and that was us, and that was a DI, me as sergeant, and a DC with me as well. I think we started off somewhere around Old Street. I think we picked it up on the first telephone call, and then went north from there to various places, and several different telephone calls to different places. The money was put out on the verge, but it stayed in the verge and nobody came to it.
But there was a suspicious vehicle that drove past.
Past it, twice, I think. We pulled into a cafe past the drop zone. After a while, this Volvo came in quite slowly, and one of its lights was out, and it was a bit dirty. Perhaps it was muddy, I don't know.
And the occupants?
They were two Indians, yeah.
Two Indians in the car?
Yes.
Did you follow that car or leave it?
It just drove through and out again, basically. But the instructions were to leave it, and anything that came through, so it came in, went back out. We then stayed there basically for two and a half hours. In the end, it was thought by about 2 o'clock in the morning that they weren't going to pick it up, and it was called off.
The failure of the ransom drop saw Alec McKay making another appeal for his wife's safe return.
Of course, terribly worried. I am frantic that I can get my wife back again. What can I do? I'm only asking the cooperation of everybody who may be watching, who may be listening, or may be reading, to please help us to get her back again.
Unfortunately, the kidnappers refused to surrender. Instead, they warned the police if there were any more tricks, Mrs. McKay would be killed. The kidnappers now set a new date for the handover of the money, Friday, February the 6th. On that day, police were sent on a goose chase between telephone boxes and tube stations around London. The phone rang at Epping Station telling them to take a taxi to Bishop Stortford and leave the money opposite a minivan parked on the forecourt of Gates Garage. The cases were deposited as requested, but before they could be collected, they were disturbed by passers-by. Once again, the drop had failed, and Mrs. Mackay's life now hung in the balance. The failure of the 2 ransom drops now left the police waiting for new instructions from the kidnappers. Tony Stevens was one of the detectives involved in the next stage of the investigation. This involved trying to trace the driver and passenger of a Volvo sighted near the ransom drop.
We'd been on a search on North Weald Airfield first and found nothing there, and then thought we should perhaps go and have a look around and see what we could find out in the area. And we went round asking local people, did they know a couple of Indians at all, because it was apparent by that time. And we found somebody who said, yeah, there's a couple of Indians who've got a farm up the road. They've been there some time. And we got up on top of this hill with binoculars and looked down on the farm and saw that it was a pig farm. And we lay on the top and saw the brothers coming in and out on the farm.
Did you see the Volvo?
Yes.
Okay.
We saw the Volvo at that time.
The men of Indian ethnicity the police were after were in fact from the West Indies in the Caribbean. 2 men who would be eventually identified as the Hussein brothers. In a police swoop, they were arrested at the farm. Whilst there was no sign of Mrs. Mackay, there was evidence of the kidnap. Evidence enough to see them brought in for questioning. David Bowen, I understand that you kind of spoke to them, as was the norm, after they'd been charged, to take their antecedents. That's to find out about their kind of background history, how long they'd been, their occupation, etc. What can you tell me about the Hussein brothers?
What I do remember is speaking to them both. Arthur Hussein, who was the older brother, I think he was 30, 35, something like that, and Nizamuddin Hussein, who was about 21 at the time. I thought that Nizamuddin Hussein was a strong character, but then I started thinking about it, and really the brains behind it seemed to be Arthur Hussein, because he was older for a start, but Nizamuddin Hussein, he seemed more of a criminal than Arthur Hussein.
Streetwise? More streetwise?
Yes, he seemed to be, as if he'd been involved in more criminality than Arthur Hussein in the past.
The brothers Arthur and Nizamuddin Hussein had been born in Trinidad. Arthur came to England in 1955 and worked as a tailor's cutter, but his dream was to become a landowner. So in 1968, he borrowed heavily to buy Rook's farm, plunging himself into debt. Perhaps this is what led him to come up with such a harebrained scheme to get rich quick.
Arthur was quite odd, in as much as he was very chatty, as if nothing had happened. Nizamuddin, his brother, was obviously very concerned. As the evidence piled up against them, Nizamuddin became more introvert, whereas Arthur didn't seem to change.
What there can be no doubt about is that the brothers committed the crime together. And as the interview progressed, the hope was that one of the pair would crack and reveal what had happened to Mrs. Mackay. What did the Hussein brothers say when asked what happened to Mrs. Mackay?
They never ever answered that question, either of them. And to this day, we don't know where she is.
With no sign of Mrs. Mackay, the police's worst fears were becoming a reality, and the hunt was now on to find her body. A search area of almost 50 square miles was scoured from the home counties down to the Thames. Ken, in 1969, you were a member of the Metropolitan Police Underwater Search Unit.
Yes.
What did that entail?
It was a frogman team, and it was 4 or 5 of us who were interested in diving, and basically they just sent you anywhere, the Thames, canals, looking for bodies and jewellery and whatever you were told to look for.
At what point was the underwater search team brought in to the investigation?
Initially we thought they had some information, i.e. search that pond, so we didn't know. I mean, we weren't told, we were just told to go and dive into it. It was very icy and we had to break the ice on the top, of course, so we were a bit suspicious whether, you know, the body had gone in there, but still we did that. But subsequent to that, of course, it went on for sort of 30, 40 days, I believe, and we sort of dived in just about every bit of water, I think, that was in the home counties, I think, where people were suggesting that a body might be. So we didn't have a day off for a month, and so we got to learn all the waterways in London, including the canals and ponds and swimming pools even.
In that search, Ken, did you find any bodies?
Yes, we did. Not bodies they wanted, unfortunately, you know, and which didn't please the investigation team, because obviously we were sidetracked then, and but that was it, we had to do it.
I can only imagine, you know, that kind of job of finding bodies is not really one to be kind of envied of, because of the very nature of water and distortion and fishes having a go at the body. That's a kind of a grueling job.
You can only ever see that much. Even then, even though it's clean, people call the Thames a lot cleaner, you can only ever see that far in front of you. So when you come across a body, you're up pretty close to it, and so it can be frightening.
And what toll did it have on you?
I think after nearly 5 years, I had enough. There was just too many bodies being found.
The Hussein brothers, it turned out to be, were a pair of amateurs, and Mrs. McKay did not stand a chance. This poor woman that was abducted from her home and subsequently murdered. I think the Hussein brothers wanted to get rid of her quite quickly. They felt that they wouldn't be ever convicted of a murder if there wasn't a body. Roy, in your experience as an SIO, how difficult is it to get a prosecution where there are no bodies, or how difficult is it to dispose of a body?
If you cut from pubis to throat and you open up, what I say, unzip the body, there's an awful lot of material that you've got to be dealing with. And it would take an awful lot of planning to dispose of a body with some certainty that it would never be discovered.
Because there's that old adage, isn't there? That is probably very true, you know, every contact leaves a trace.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, we're much more acute now at finding that trace element, that contact point. I have to say, some offenders, bad people, actually equally bring up their game so that they fail to leave a trace. It's not impossible.
Mm. In this particular case, of course, Mrs. McKay was never found, but the police, when they searched Rook Farm, they found all sorts of things with continuity of evidence vis-a-vis the elastopast, you know, elements of the twine that had been used. There was considerable evidence that the police found, letters or handwriting examples, implications that the Hussein brothers had been involved in this, but of course there was no indication that Mrs. McKay had ever been there or indeed had died there.
Well, I think if we look at the McKay case, it was really the benchmark in understanding that a murder conviction could be reached by a jury in the absence of the body, the corpus delicti. And so thereafter, there was never any doubt in the English judicial system that it was safe to convict. For the SIO, I think it had a whole new dimension. So you would actually look for other strands of evidence that, whilst not pointing to a living person, would tell you beyond reasonable doubt, tough test, beyond reasonable doubt, that person has deceased and is with us no more.
To find Mrs. McKay, be it alive or dead, was now almost exclusively the focus of the police investigation. With still no sign of a body in the waterways or on land, it was the press who developed a new theory of what may have happened to Mrs. McKay's corpse. What do you think happened to Mrs. McKay?
Well, the rumour at the time was that the Husseins, being farmers and having somewhere between a small holding and a farm, had access to pigs, and that the pigs have a capacity to devour the whole human torso. That's got to include the skull, of course, and the long bones. And whilst I can't say that it's impossible, it challenges me to think that was the case, and I would like some forensic appreciation of whether or not pigs were so capable of devouring a corpse that there'd be no trace at all. I'd like to think these days that would not be the case.
But as with so many aspects of this case, the various scenarios surrounding what happened to Mrs. McKay's corpse continue to divide opinion.
From my personal experience of when I was a boy working on a farm in Wales, I don't think that was possible. I made my point clear then. But that, unfortunately, came from the press. That, as far as I know, never came from any source other than the press.
And the reason being it never came from any source other than the press is the police had no evidence. It was pure speculation.
Absolutely. I mean, the search at the farm was relentless. It went on for a long time, involved a lot of officers. I'm pretty sure that never happened. And it was just very sad for the family that that was said.
So in kidnap, you've got a live, body. That's difficult to manage and to care for. Do you think that Mrs. McKay had been killed quite early on?
I think that probably certainly within 2 weeks of them kidnapping her, I personally believe that she was murdered within that time period. And then that was one of the reasons why the ransom demands were more sporadic, because they couldn't produce any more evidence that she was alive.
With no body, no witnesses, and in an era before DNA, the trial at the Old Bailey went ahead and rested on one key piece of evidence.
At the trial, when the defence finished their evidence on the fingerprints, the prosecution counsel, who I think was the Attorney General, he was given the opportunity of questioning the defence expert, who then agreed, in his opinion, that the other fingerprints were the brothers.
So now you've got two fingerprint experts, one for the prosecution, one for the defence, both agreeing with each other
that all the other fingerprints did belong to the two brothers. And these fingerprints, of course, were on the paper flowers that were used for the drop, and on certain documents and envelopes that were sent to the family with Mrs. McKay's letters in.
Were there any admissions made by the Hussein brothers?
Nizamuddin's barrister went away with Nizamuddin and then came back with certain admissions, and Nizamuddin then, from that point on, blamed his brother Arthur. You see, once the fingerprint evidence came out, like it did, it linked all of those demands, and that linked to her letters to the family. And of course they were totally responsible for what happened to her because she was in their hands.
Found guilty of all charges, the Hussein brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment. Arthur died in prison, but Nizam served 20 years and was deported to Trinidad after his release. The Hussein brothers, Arthur Hussein, he died in prison some time ago, but his younger brother, Nizam Hussein, remains living in Trinidad. But he has the secret of where the body of Mrs. McKay is. And sadly, by the looks of it, he's going to take that secret to his own grave. When a body is not found, of course it must put a void on the investigation, and more importantly, a void in the life of the McKay family. I think one of the saddest things was Mr. McKay wanted and asked, he said, I just want to take a bunch of flowers to the place where my wife is. Dr. Julian Bruin, forensic psychologist, this case refers to the disappearance, abduction of Muriel McKay way back in 1969, the wife of Alec McKay, deputy to Rupert Murdoch. One of the things, having researched this case at depth, is the void that is left for the McKay family.
Extraordinary trauma and sadness without any form of closure.
What's that about, not telling?
One of them is dead now, having twice made an appeal through the courts and also the tribunals to get out. No success whatsoever. And one of the reasons for that is he's absolutely insisting that he had nothing to do with it. And to the extent he made any accusations at all, he said it was his brother. And the other one was insisting it was his brother. Not uncommon for that sort of thing to happen, of two people acting together. Reality, we strongly believe, is that they were both acting together. So why did they not tell? I think they want that just to be shut down. They don't, and there's another thing, I'm afraid, which is somewhat chilling. I don't think they really care, actually, about it. They don't want to acknowledge they've done it, and they'll stay with that cosy line till their death day. Even in the court, the boys, particularly Arthur, was distinctly arrogant and self-centred. So they sort of accused him of murdering poor Mrs. McKay and the blackmail and all the rest of it. Then he holds up his hands like that, with fingers splayed apart, and says, "These are the hands of an artist, not a murderer." That tells you the mismatch of his perception of the world and reality. And it was that led him to overextend himself financially to buy the farmhouse. That which I think led him to this harebrained scheme, which had so many flaws in it, it was untrue. But like you, it is abhorrent to me that someone could deprive the McKay family of knowing, if not even what happened, where she is.
The case is definitely one that is etched on the minds of all who worked on it, filled with details you can never forget. Where does this sit for you, the case of Mrs. McKay?
One of the biggest, and probably one of the cases where British policing learnt most.
Mm. And I think as well, although you did get the Hussein brothers who were convicted,
yeah,
it remains unfinished business.
Most certainly. A lot of my old colleagues have unfortunately died since, but everybody was of the same opinion. That's what it was, unfinished business. I served for 30 years, and it was the biggest case and one of the longest cases probably in British criminal history, I should think.
The tragic kidnapping and murder of Mrs. McKay led the police to develop a new approach and procedures to dealing with such crimes. Despite advances in technology, these procedures remain in place to this day. What happened thereafter was that specialist teams started to be developed. So there is a highly polished kidnap squad that the Metropolitan Police have today in 2020. That evolved from the abduction of Mrs. McKay. So lots of things, I think, evolved from this case to where the police are now sitting in 2020 with highly sophisticated teams investigating homicide, hostage negotiating, and kidnap and the like. Yet for me, This isn't to be remembered as a story about the police learning from their errors. It remains a human story at its heart, about a loving family denied closure. I feel frustrated over 51 years later that Mr. McKay and his family have no place to put any flowers down in the memory of his wife and their mother and probably grandmother by now. That's really, really sad. And one man, Nizam Hussain, holds the key to that information, and there is a sense of frustration, helplessness, that after this man dies, Nizam Hussain, the secret dies with him. And that's the bit that is really kind of hard as to why Nizam Hussain doesn't have it within him to give some form of peace to this family as to where Muriel McKay was buried. My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. Today I'm going to be looking at the case of Fred and Rosemary West. This couple still continue to attract the attention of the public and the media, and I think that interest in the West case comes from trying to understand why this couple inflicted so much depravity and torture on many of the victims who were vulnerable, and that Fred and Rose West initially offered these young girls some love and nurturing that they had not previously experienced. Often many were from broken homes, and just offering them a glass of orange juice and biscuits sucked them in, and they all subsequently were sexually abused, tortured and murdered. It's very, very hard to comprehend how two human beings could inflict so much pain and agony to young, vulnerable victims and their own children.
Hello?
Oh, is that you, Howard Ogden?
Hello.
Hi to you. My name's Jackie Molton. I'm ex-detective from Scotland Yard. I just wondered whether or not that you would be willing to speak to me, because I understand, Howard, that you were Fred West's defence solicitor from the point of time when he was arrested for murder.
That's absolutely correct, and yes, I'm happy to talk to you.
I'm fascinated to meet solicitor Howard Ogden. The relationship between police and defence lawyers is always professional, but not necessarily easy. And I can only imagine the tension in the police interrogation room as one of the biggest murder investigations in history was about to unfold. This is the first full interview Howard Ogden has ever agreed to give.
I was actually en route to Stroud Magistrates Court as the phone went to say that Fred had been arrested, and because my mind was really on where I had to go and the case I was going to do over at Stroud. I just gave him the sort of time-honoured solicitor's advice: keep your mouth shut, Fred, and I'll see you later when I get there. To which I got the reply, well, I've already admitted it.
Fred West had admitted to the murder of his daughter, Heather. Police were digging up the garden at his house at 25 Cromwell Street, following escalating rumours that he had killed his teenage daughter and buried her there. As Howard Ogden arrived at the police station, he and the other officers present were quickly seeing the Jekyll and Hyde character of a man who was about to be revealed as a serial killer.
Fred was a different personality with different people. Fred was very respectful of authority. Fred was a staunch Thatcherite. He played all us professionals off against one another. If he met a counsel appointed in the case or a doctor, he would be extremely polite and extremely courteous. Once that was over, and he and I were discussing interviews, and I was getting his instructions, he spoke with the speed of a machine gun going off, and I had to remove in my mind the expletives that were dotted about in it in order to get his actual instructions as to what the position was.
Can you remember how you felt in that first interview?
The first interview was chilling. It rather set the scene for subsequent interviews, in that here were four complete strangers. The traditional view of the detective meeting the defense lawyer is that we're kind of daggers drawn and we're opposites. Yet, by the time we got to the end of that interview, it was something that none of us had come across professionally before, because of the matter-of-fact way in which horrific details were being given to us by Fred. And at the end, these four complete strangers, we just stood, and we left that interview, and there was a little tea room just outside, and we actually had what I could only describe as a group hug.
As I'll find out later, any relief Howard or those present were to feel would be short-lived, as the full horrors of the case began to unfold in the preceding days. How could these crimes have taken place in a respectable cathedral city such as Gloucester? You look around Gloucester and it's hard to imagine how this could have gone on in the middle of a bustling city centre. But as a detective, you sometimes have to figure out what's been going on behind closed doors. One man who went through the closed doors of Cromwell Street was given the task by the official solicitor in documenting in detail all of the materials gathered on Fred and Rose West after their arrest. I'm now going to speak to Geoffrey Wansall, who was appointed the official biographer of Fred West and was given unique access to the prison diaries that Fred completed, the audio evidence against him, and the video evidence taken by the police to compile the case against Fred West. Geoffrey Wansall has agreed to meet me at the site where 25 Cromwell Street once stood, the house now demolished to make way for a thoroughfare that we both now stand upon. It's the first time Geoffrey has been back since the horrors of the case unfolded. He remains the only civilians who have ever seen all of the materials seized by the police from the house. What does it feel like to be back at the site of 25 Cromwell Street, because you were so embroiled in this story as the official biographer?
Frankly, it's spine-chilling. It brings not tears, but melancholy. This was a place where horrible, horrible things happened to perfectly innocent young women who were looking for love and found instead death. They were abused, tortured, mutilated, buried, all on this very spot. And there's no way I can come back to this street and not feel really dreadful. It's as if someone's treading on your spine, as if a ghost is looking over your shoulder.
Regarding the archives of Fred West, how did you get hold of them? Where were they? What was the process? How did you do it?
Well, it was very eerie. Rose's trial had begun on the Tuesday, and on that weekend I was summoned to a solicitor's office in London where I had to meet a little man at 11 o'clock. And the only thing in the room is a big grey double-doored filing cabinet. He says, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to lock you in. You can't take anything out, and I'm going to have to search you when you leave. Shuts the door, locks it, and I'm left there. I open this filing cabinet, and it's a complete jumble. And right in the middle is a cardboard box. So I take out the cardboard box and I put it on the table, and inside is Frederick West's clothes, all the way down to his underpants and his shoes. I think if there was one moment in which my life changed, it was at that moment. And even today, I can capture it in my mind. Yeah, I swallowed, put the box back, and picked up an audio tape completely random, and I put it into the little cassette player, and I pressed play. Police interview. I'd just like to give us your name for the benefit of the tape, Fred. Frederick Walter Stephen West. Okay, we want to talk to you about Heather. What happened exactly, Fred? Well, you see, Rose had gone out shopping, and Heather was in a bad temper anyway. Well, I killed her. She was being difficult.
The grounds that Geoffrey and I are standing on would be where the remains of the West daughter Heather were to be found. But the discovery of her body would sadly prove to be the first of many found in the garden that the Wests had turned into a cemetery. I'm in Gloucester reinvestigating the horrific crimes committed by killing couple Fred and Rose West. And I'm en route to meet the man the detectives asked to assist them with interviewing Fred West, a killer of which the likes of Gloucester police had never seen before or since. Professor Paul Britton, consultant psychologist. In 1994, you were asked by Gloucestershire police to help them with a case of Fred West.
They had a man, Frederick West, who was in custody, but they couldn't really make sense of at that stage. He was friendly, he was affable, and his story was that he had got into arguments with three, I think it was, young women, one of them his daughter, and out of the arguments they had accidentally died. And instead of him doing what he now knows he should have done, he thought he would get into trouble, so he thought he would hide it. And being a builder, he hid these people under the patio. He buried them in the garden. And this was something that the police officers were finding difficult to make sense of and wanted to know how best to talk to him, because as they began to talk to him in those early stages, he seemed to slip away from them.
How did you build up a picture of Fred West and Cromwell Street in order to help the police?
I need to know as much as I possibly can about the people concerned. So I have access to files going back years that deal with earlier offences. And it involves not just Frederick West, but even more centrally, his wife, Mrs. West. And I look at that, and of course, sadly, I have seen those personalities, those temperaments, those activities many times before. The thing that's absolutely clear is that you're dealing with two sexual predators, serial predators.
What drives Fred and Rose West to behave and groom and murder these innocent victims in such a way?
I think when you describe, as you just have, the bestiality and the direction that they went, you really go to the heart of the difficulty that confronted the investigating officers. You're looking at people who are ordinary, normal human beings. They go home to their wives, husbands, children at the end of the day. And the extent of the depravity, the sadism, the torture that the Wests visited will be the first time that most of those officers have ever encountered anything like that. And sadly, it will never go away from them. I'm in the position of at least being partially removed from it. Although I was there, I was in Cromwell Street, I've seen all of the things. It didn't fall to me to put the spade in the floor and go through the black, gloopy mess that was the remains of these young women.
Tragically, that messy mixture of mud and sewage would also contain the human remains of innocent victims, the numbers of which were about to escalate at an alarming rate. Someone who did find themselves subjected to wading through the quagmire looking for human remains was legendary Home Office pathologist Professor Bernard Knight.
Pitch dark, of course, and pouring the rain, and they had their tent up and a hole in the ground where people had been digging down. We were all assuming that there was one body there because the thigh bone which I saw in the police station was a left-sided one. And of course the crunch came when I found another left femur. And I remember telling John Bennett, "You've got more than one body." I can't remember exactly how many there were in the garden, but I remember one that was pregnant because we found the remains of a fetus in it.
And was that process of digging in Cromwell Street kind of a really slow process?
Yes, yes. They were thick with mud. It was so bad that sometimes I had rubber boots on and I was stuck in the hole. And on one occasion at least, the police had to lift me out of my boots.
Because you were stuck?
Yeah, well, this is the sort of environment that these bits were lying in. And I think that Fred had also broken the sewer. So we had sewage mixed up in this mix as well.
With the eventual discovery of 5 bodies in the garden, the excavations moved into the basement where further bodies would be retrieved. Some of them were more intact than those from the garden and showed evidence of the torture that had been inflicted upon them.
Some of the ones in the cellar had what you might call masks. That what they would have either a belt or a piece of clothing tied around the head so that it supported the chin. And one, at least one, had polythene tubes pushed up the nostril.
Like straws or something?
Yes, in order to produce air, to convey air.
It's an anathema to even imagine what that would be like.
People always ask me, how can you do such a horrible job?
But you're a scientist, a pathologist, your job, isn't it, to find the cause of death, what happened?
I think it's a process of natural selection. If you can't do the job, you don't do it.
Disturbed by the details of the forensic dig that Professor Knight had shared with me, I'm returning to see Professor Paul Britton to try and get an understanding of how the West could have even imagined, let alone committed, these kinds of crimes. You have previously described them as sexual psychopaths.
Yes. I mean people who feel no remorse, no conscience at the pain and the suffering of the people they're interacting with, so that their victims are not there any longer as people. They are there purely as instruments and objects for the pleasure of the Wests. There were the masks, there were the bindings, and you will see that the masks progress from simple covers to including devices that ensure that the victims experience prolonged terror. They can't see, they can't speak, but they must be kept alive to breathe. Now, how did they do that? Well, they punch a tooth out and they push a pipe through the mask so that they can still breathe. Now, the terror is so thrilling, but it's never quite enough. There's always something else we might think of.
As I gradually gain a better understanding of the background of these crimes, I recall when I first heard the names Fred and Rose West, names now synonymous with serial murder and sexual sadism. I was serving as a detective in the Metropolitan Police when the West case was starting to be investigated. And I remember, Gloucestershire Police, not a big police force, but the magnitude of dealing with this huge number of victims and the police not knowing who they were or where they came from. They had nothing. They had, sadly, hundreds and hundreds of bones and skeletons and nothing else. And so this is where forensic evidence is crucial. It is the lead in the sense of a murder investigation.
I'm about to meet the forensic experts who led the way in identifying all of the young women murdered by the Wests.
Professor David Whitaker, you are a world-renowned forensic dentist. What does that mean?
My technology at that time, we're talking 25 years ago, was principally based on reconstructing the face from photographs and so on and superimposing details from a high-quality photograph showing the teeth, but not only the teeth, the eyes, the mouth, and making those images fit with the set of remains that I was brought. So my job was explained to me really as being, can you find out who these girls they were then, who they are? I was told that there were about 10,000 missing females in the UK round about this time. I decided early on that I would need to age at death each of the sets of remains as they became available, because that would narrow down the field enormously. From 10,000 it came down to hundreds.
So the identification primarily of these poor victims comes from you?
Yes. Yes, pretty well entirely, yeah. I mean, there were inevitably other issues that the detectives are all working on. There's a big team. Of all the cases I've done, 800 or more, this one stands out to me as brilliant policing.
Were there any peculiarities of dental records or identification?
There was one skull which had 4 teeth missing. One, we call it the lateral tooth. And what I did was to take out the other one. We call it the contralateral tooth. So I got a technician to make a tooth, but swapped through 360 degrees. And he did it. And I slotted that into the socket, and it went in as if it had been there forever. And the thing about it was sticking out into the lip, as teeth sometimes do. And when the photographs arrived, I couldn't believe it. Both of them showed this tooth sticking out into the lip.
Protruding tooth.
A protruding tooth. And it was that feature that clinched her identity.
David Whitaker's work saw many families able to give their loved ones a proper burial. But I do fear that there are other victims we still don't know about.
Only Rose West can answer those questions now, but I doubt whether she thinks it's in her best interest to do so.
As husband Fred sat before the police recounting his crimes in graphic detail, police became convinced that he could not have hidden the extent of his crimes from Rose. So she too found herself under arrest and brought in for questioning. One man who came to know Rose West better than most was a solicitor who was called in to defend her, Leo Goatley.
Hello?
Oh, is that Mr. Goatley?
Yes.
Hi Leo, my name's Jackie Molton. I'm ex-Scotland Yard detective. I'm just looking into the case of Fred and Rose West, and I understand you were the defence solicitor for Rosemary West.
That's right.
I wondered if I could come and see you, Leo, see if I could kind of understand through you what was going on in the mind of Rosemary West and your knowledge of her.
Yeah, I'd agree to that.
So when you interviewed Rose West, what did you think about her?
A complete contrast with the dreadful nature of the allegation. Here was a rather frumpy wife of a builder, you know, a hard-working mum. She was always communicative and sociable with me, but it was on her terms. She wouldn't be challenged. If you took her out of a comfort zone, it would be a different matter.
Mm. not you, Leo Goatley, as a solicitor, but you, Leo Goatley, as a father, husband. What's going on inside of you?
At that stage, I wasn't convinced of her guilt, but there was an awful lot of evidence accumulating. I suspect by the trial, mindful of the due process, I would have had my doubts. I was trying to remain professional and stay focused that Rose West was my client and she was denying any knowledge. So of course it was deeply disturbing, horrific, you know, and you have to try and deal with that.
So are you quite happy with that answer now?
Yeah, I've no doubt that Rose West was complicit, but it's 25 years ago and I've had a lot of time to think about it. You know, it's not a decision that I could come to as a, you know, in a flash. I've pondered it for a long time.
If we look back at Rose and her own upbringing with her father, Bill Letts.
Well, there was a huge disconnect between what she actually told me, which was rather idealised. She wrote a lengthy proof of evidence. The police were saying, hang on, they were telling me that Rose West had been abused. She was denying that. She only admitted it after the trial. But there's no doubt that there was ingrained serious intergenerational incest in her family in the same way there was in Fred West's family. And that is, in my view, a major factor in her development. So Bill Letts singled Rose out and he groomed her and abused her, probably from an early age, and that would have resulted in full sex by the time she was about 11 or 12, I think.
Is it true that that carried on even as an adult when she was still, in fact she was married to Fred?
Fred West used to invite Bill Letts to the house, and he would encourage Rose to have sex with Bill Letts whilst he watched. And I always felt that the sex with Rose, it was like her currency and had been from an early stage. It's what made her daddy's pet. It's what stopped her being beaten like her siblings. And I think she carried that through.
Almost like perfunctory.
Yeah, and as a nubile young girl, blokes liked her if they could have sex with her.
Rose West's extremely abusive upbringing at the hands of her incestuous father must have been both emotionally and psychologically damaging. But I'm wondering if forensic psychologist Professor Paul Britton can shed any light on what part, if any, these early years may have played in West's genesis as a serial killer.
I wanted to ask you about Fred West's first kind of sexual encounter was with his mother and vice versa, that Rose West's first sexual encounter was with her own father. That was part of her learned behaviours and therefore a shared history between the two of them.
Out in the world, there are thousands of youngsters, boys, girls, who are sexually abused within families and elsewhere on an intergenerational basis. A very, very small number of those go on to become the sort of creatures that Rose and Frederick West became. They didn't have to go down this pathway. I think that is more true for Frederick West than for Rosemary West. I think that once she became bonded with him, he opened the doors, liberated the possibilities of the depravity that came in her. If she'd encountered someone else who didn't have those propensities, she might not have gone down that sort of pathway. Once she was launched, no stopping her.
Even as a seasoned detective myself, I'm finding much of the information about this case difficult to comprehend. I can only imagine the mental toll it must have taken on those who were having to experience it firsthand, perhaps none more so than Fred West's defence solicitor, Howard Ogden.
Your role is that of a solicitor to defend him, but how does Howard Ogden, you know, the family man, the father, how did you feel?
I can't imagine a more conflicting situation than representing Fred. I had a role of looking after him to a degree in that respect, the humanitarian bit, if you like. The police station was given temporary prison status so as to avoid any transportation between the custody suite and the prison. So my role involved things like doing his washing, organising a haircut, organising videos to keep him entertained. I also had to deal with artifacts that were being removed, like, for example, the fish that I had to take control of in the fish tank. But people do challenge and say, well, how can you do it? How can you represent somebody like this? You don't have choices in this sense. You are obliged to follow it through. You can't pick and choose what you're going to do or who you're going to represent.
When you went to visit him in prison, did you start to see any decline in his mental health?
I never found any decline in mental health, and I was, to say the least, surprised when I was told one New Year's Day, when I was down in the custody suite in Gloucester and taken aside by a senior officer to advise me that Fred had been found.
What did you feel yourself?
I did not, and still do not, find it credible that Fred took his own life.
Are you inferring that he was killed?
I can't say what did or didn't happen. All I can say is from my dealings with Fred, I think that takes a degree of courage to take your own life. And I didn't find him to have that form of courage at all.
This startling admission by Howard Ogden may be at odds with the official inquiry into Fred West's death, which found he had taken his own life. But one thing is for certain, Fred's death threw the whole murder trial into chaos, and in doing so brought Rose's involvement in the crimes more closely into focus. Fred and Rose West were bound in a murderous union where sexual sadism and murder became part of the fabric of their everyday life. Detectives in Gloucester could never have been prepared for a series of serial murders such as these that have happened on their patch. But when they realised what was happening, they acted impeccably and brought in leading experts to help assist and ensure justice was done. One of their focuses was to ensure they achieved everything possible from the interviews in the police interrogation room.
One of the duties that I felt I had with the investigators early in the case was to explain that their work with Frederick West was very important to him. I'd help the officers to develop a working relationship with him that allowed them to put their repugnance to one side. And what I had to explain is that that's fine, but do understand that when you move him to a holding prison and your contact reduces and it's clear that Rose has repudiated him, he will kill himself.
Oh, gosh.
And of course,
you anticipated that?
Yeah, to explain that. All of that narcissistic pleasure would fall away. He would no longer have the apparent resource of Rose. He would kill him. Remember, he'd seen how many people die. He'd been involved in it. He knew what dying's all about. He took himself away. But it's not going to happen to Rose West. She's much, much stronger.
The death of Fred West on remand now put the police's spotlight firmly on wife Rose, especially in relation to the disappearance and death of their daughter Charmaine. I'm returning to meet solicitor Leo Goatley to see how this shift in the investigation saw Rose West become a prime suspect in the case.
So it all changes for Rose, doesn't it, Leo, when Fred kills himself on New Year's Day of 1995?
Yeah, that is a significant moment. It's at that point that some people are saying, oh, well, she shouldn't face trial. I actually went to visit her on the 1st of January 95, within about an hour or two of it being announced that Fred had hung himself at Winston Green.
Did she know, or did you tell her?
I had to tell her, and you know, her response was conflicted. On the one hand, I think there was a kind of glow of excitement a feeling that this was it. She wasn't going to have to face a trial. But I think she also betrayed a slight kind of sadness that she didn't want to admit that, you know, Fred was dead. It was only a few days later that the police said, no, we want to interview again about Charmaine. And then she was charged with Charmaine, and any sense of hope that it might all be over was soon dashed.
Charmaine's remains had been found buried under an old garage pit at the West's former marital home on Midland Road. I'm on my way back to see forensic dentist Professor David Whittaker. Finding out the date of Charmaine's death would prove to be imperative if police were able to prove she had been killed by Rose West. In doing so, increasing the culpability of her involvement in the many other deaths.
Can I ask you, David, specifically about the case of Charmaine West? Can you talk me through your evidence?
Yeah, and I started working on Charmaine. This set of remains was the only child. Now, this means that her face was growing and the teeth are developing in length, in size, and so on. And all of that information was in the skull, in the remains of this body from 25 Midland Road, but it was also in the photographs. So I could age this unfortunate young child to within about 3 months either way. Unfortunately, the negatives, the photographer had written on the negatives the day on which they were taken. So I had a day when the photograph was taken, I had the skull and the teeth had moved. Now, I know from, you know, being a dental forensic guy, more or less how the rate at which this growth occurs. And I knew that this child had died a certain number of weeks after the photograph was taken. Now, I'd suspected when I got the photograph that I might be able to do this. And that is why I said to the police, I'm not going to look at the media. And I signed a document saying that because they had let slip, the police had, that Frederick West had been in jail round about the time that they thought Charmaine had died. The brilliance of it was that when I went to trial as a witness, expert witness in Winchester, Defence QC, he said, tell the court when Frederick West was in jail. So I paused and said, no. I said to the judge, my lord, I actually signed an affidavit with the police not to seek this information when Frederick West was in jail. And as I stand here now, my answer is correct. I cannot tell him when Frederick West was in jail. And that's when the adrenaline flows away and you think, you don't show it in court, you think, got it.
The damning evidence accrued by Professor Whittaker would condemn Rose West forever as a serial killer. With a growing body of evidence stacking up against her, it fell to the defence solicitor Leo Goatley to try to process it all and present it to his clients.
Did Rose West ever admit killing anyone?
No. And as far as I know, she still hasn't. What she did admit after the trial, which I personally thought was very significant, was she said that everything Anne-Marie had said was true. Well, she'd been absolutely adamant that everything Anne-Marie said was a lie.
Anne-Marie was the West daughter who had bravely come forward and revealed to the police the long history of sexual abuse inflicted by her parents at Cromwell Street.
Which included appalling sexual abuse with contraptions in the basement, of going out with Rose and then effectively being abducted by Fred and Rose and beaten in a car, you know, and binding. So it was all there. And Rose was admitting that. And you think, well, if she's admitting this, you know, it's very much part of the description of what happened to the other girls.
At the conclusion of a trial, Rose West was found guilty of 10 murders and would be sentenced to life in prison. Leo was there to observe her reaction.
That was one of those rare moments where she was totally distraught and devastated. I suppose it was one of those moments of realisation that this is it. She's going to spend the rest of her life in prison and that she's been convicted. In a sense, if she'd seen that coming, she wouldn't have been so devastated. So there was she probably was slightly delusional about the way things were going.
How has this case of Fred and Rose West affected you as a man personally?
It's probably had quite a big impact. And I'm lucky in that I've got a loving, cohesive, supportive family, and that makes a big difference. I think in the early years I tried to, and certainly during the case, I tried to pretend that it was just professional involvement and I could forget about it. But in fact, I think, according to my wife and my eldest daughter, I made everybody else's life hell. So it was obviously having an impact. And I have tried to forget about the case, but to see that close up is, it's alarming and sobering, and it's bound to have an impact.
Hearing Leo's words makes me feel that this case, more than any I've ever looked at, saw the solicitors who represented the West subjected to the most scrutiny and pressure of anyone involved in the tragic episode, a pressure that would only intensify under the glare of the media spotlight.
Did you feel any pressure yourself that the press wanted to get access to you and kind of ask for your opinion?
I had to deal with media pressure without any form of training in that regard at all. That was ongoing, and we had the world's press around and about. The press was speculating to such a degree that it needed to be addressed within Parliament, as indeed it was. I had come out subsequently as a gay man, and so there were then issues of literally described as pervert defends pervert, bearing in mind that we're talking about attitudes of over 25 years ago.
How did you feel about that yourself?
You get so busy with what you have to do that anything with regards to yourself, you are putting to the back of your mind.
Do you feel traumatised by being his solicitor?
Certainly, it was a traumatic experience, there's no doubt about that, and there were concerns that I should be psychiatrically debriefed so as to deal with that. Curiously enough, one way of dealing with that is this interview. It's bringing matters to the surface. It's a cleansing, if you like.
Everybody involved in the case of Rosemary and Fred West have been scarred by it. And even after 25 years later, revisiting the scene, it is absolutely daunting.
Despite having spoken to so many leading experts involved in the case, I'm still interested to hear psychologist Dr. Julian Boone's take on how two people could have shared their madness and killed as a folie à deux.
It's so horrible that another person, or two people, Fred and Rose West, can inflict such sadistic torture and eventually murdering these girls. How can they do that to another human being? Is this something about being, I don't know, a sexual psychopath?
Sexual psychopathy fits very well. And if you align that to sadism and a sadistic personality trait, then you've got a very dangerous alignment of the two things, because first of all, you've got the desire for gratification, but if you've got a conscience, particularly you or I have, you couldn't do that sort of thing to someone else. Even if you had the proclivity so to do, you wouldn't do it. If, on the other hand, you're a psychopath, you ain't got no conscience, and you ain't going to go down the shops and buy one, so you're just going to act out, do it, self-gratify.
Rosemary West remains in prison and will never be released. She's very, very kind of reluctant, you know, to talk about anything. Is it just too dark to go back into and think about?
No. And probably the better explanation for why she hasn't talked about anything to do with it is that it's her private world and she doesn't want us to enter into it. It's like a dog in a kennel with his bone. She just doesn't want anybody else to know. That's my preferred explanation for why she doesn't talk. She must know that she's never going to get out of jail. And so why she doesn't talk and let people know what happened for the sake of the relatives and all the rest of it. But no, my preferred explanation would be she just wants to keep it all to herself.
And relive it?
Oh, I can't believe otherwise. Yes, I can't believe that she wouldn't relive it. It's so deeply ingrained as a personality characteristic and so many memories of the gratification that I can't believe she wouldn't relive it. Mentally, I mean. We hear from reports she spends her time knitting. Well, I can't knit. If I could, I'm damn sure I can think at the same time. So, yes, private world, not to be shared.
We must not underestimate the impact of the Fred and Rose West story. 25 years later, it's hard to hear it from a very detached point of view. So when you're in it at that time, that must have been absolute torture to hear it.
All those involved found themselves challenged to the limit. Yet it was also the case which perhaps highlights better than any other how the police and forensic teams can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds to achieve justice for victims.
My name is Jackie Molton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning. My name's Jackie Molton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect.
When I first became a detective, I was always taught that murder is the search for the truth. In today's episode, we travel to Newport in South Wales to reinvestigate a death where the dual life of the victim made that search all the more difficult.
Today I'm going to revisit the case of Danny Denbury. Danny was found dead in his home on the 20th of January 1988. He was a very lovely man. Everybody liked him. He chatted to everybody. But Danny Denbury led a secret life.
I'm going to call the detective who led the team that pieced together the puzzle of this secret life in order to discover the identity of Mr. Denbury's killer.
Oh, good afternoon, Mark. It's Jackie Molton. I'm an ex-detective from the Metropolitan Police. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
I understand, Mark, that you were the senior investigating officer into the murder of Danny Denbury from Newport.
We found him dead with wounds to his head on the landing of his home in Marthas.
And would you be willing to talk to me about that investigation, because it was Danny Denbry that led a double life?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you, Mark. Thank you very much. Investigating murder is always about getting the community on board, and nothing shocks a community more than the murder of a valuable member of it. This rare footage was filmed in 1988 and features a young Mark Waters briefing the press about the murder that sent a shockwave through the community.
Well, we've got a vicious attack on this man, Mr. Denbry. He found dead in his back bedroom of his own home. The motive at the moment appears theft. Obviously, we're seeking out any friends and acquaintances, particularly anyone who saw him yesterday, that's Monday the 18th of January, near his home, or any visitors he had to his home last night.
32 years later, I'm back at the very same location with Mark Waters to see what he remembers about that fateful day. So back in 1988, Mark, you were the SIO for Gwent Police, Detective Chief Superintendent, and you get called to Pilmore Road?
That's right, yes. It was about 11:50 in the morning. I was called out to this house here, and we found Danny on the upstairs landing. He'd been beaten, kicked hard, face swollen, pronounced dead. He'd been hog-tied to the radiator, with his legs and his arms tied, what we call hog-tied.
That's crossed over?
Yes.
And his legs were crossed over?
Yes.
Okay. And what was he tied with?
He was tied with electric wire from the alarm clock. It was quite professional knots. It was, you know, the kind of knots that somebody in the army would use. In fact, we could prove that.
Is that something that you'd seen before, hog-tied?
No, I hadn't seen anybody hog-tied, not like that. If he'd kicked him and beaten him like he did, Danny was probably still gurgling there, so it might have been to stop him leaving the house and raising the alarm. We later found this cause of death as he choked on his own blood.
What do you remember most about Danny Denbry's murder?
Well, Danny was well liked by everybody, from the neighbours, everybody involved, and people who would actually work with him. He was just a nice guy.
The neighbours or somebody saw milk on his doorstep, and then they called the police.
Well, we know when he was killed. He was killed at 7:50 because
PM, the night
before, because his clock, the electric cord from his clock, was wound round him. It was used to tie him up. The clock had stopped at 7:50, so we had a fair idea when the time he was killed. But when I saw where Danny was lying, I said, we've got to pick something up from here, and I'm looking for blood-stained fingerprints, if possible. You know, we've got to depend on this scene.
This case really grabs my attention as a detective, as it's full of intrigue from the outset. Here was a man with no obvious enemies, who someone sought to fatally maim. Discovering a reason or motive for Mr. Denbry's death would have been all the more challenging because of this. I'm en route to meet Alan Chown, who was a crime scene investigator on the case and was given the challenging and sensitive task of securing the critical evidence, if any existed, at the scene.
Alan, in 1988, you were a crime scenes officer for Gwent Police, as I understand it, and called to the murder scene in Pilmore Road, where the body of Danny Denbry had been found. Where does this murder sit in your experience of being a scenes of crimes officer dealing mainly with murder?
It was one of the worst that I had come across. It was extreme violence to Mr. Denbry, and it was a heavily blood-stained scene. It was a difficult scene to work in because of that.
Can you just tell me what your role was on that day?
I attended the scene a couple of days after the body was removed. We were asked to fingerprint the house. We went around every room, fingerprinting every surface that we could that would produce fingerprints, including cutlery, glasses, doors, door frames, etc. And we produced a large number of fingerprints from that. Because the offender would have come down the banister, or might have potentially put his hand on that banister, we decided that we would remove it as a whole in order to submerge it into a large bath of chemicals in order to enhance any fingerprints that may be on it. We wouldn't have done that normally. It was only because of the seriousness of the incident itself and the difficulty, I believe, of the material on the banister itself. It was during that particular time that we were there that a colleague of mine found or discovered a very significant find in one of the rooms. In the bedroom where the deceased had been laying when he was found, he, using aluminium powder, developed a handprint on the wall close to the head of where the deceased had been lying. And it was quite significant in that the person might well have leant against that wall at the time of kicking the deceased whilst he was on the floor in that position. So that became quite significant. That fingerprint would have been lifted by means of tape and sent to the fingerprint bureau.
And I think it's important to remember, Alan, that in 1988 there was no automatic fingerprint system as we have today.
Yes, indeed.
So what that means is that it is a manual search, and not only a manual search, that each fingerprint against the database that Gwent police would have had has to be done kind of individually. That's quite time-consuming.
It's labour-intensive.
The finger and palm print Alan retrieved from the scene was deemed to be the most important piece of evidence. It was now over to Mark Waters to see if he could use it to identify a prime suspect.
We had a palm print above the body, which fitted exactly as though someone was leaning against the wall and kicking it, you know, where they take the weight on their hand. And that was a particularly good start, because at the end of the day, we had no idea who Danny was meeting.
Whilst having a fingerprint at the scene was a fantastic piece of evidence, it remained to be seen if it would match anything on the police database. The fingerprint and handprint were now to be painstakingly examined by the Gwent Police Fingerprints Bureau by hand and eye, with no computer to help. It would prove to be a mammoth task. There were over 20,000 prints held on record. Half a dozen men would be working around the clock to search for any potential matches. If there wasn't any, with no witnesses coming forward and the community afraid to speak, the investigation would be back to square one. Chief Superintendent Mark Waters was leading the police investigation into the death of popular Newport man Danny Denbury. But with each new discovery came another challenge. Tracing the origins of every fingerprint found at the crime scene would take time that the police did not have.
In 1988, we still didn't have DNA as such. We had DNA, but it was in very early stages. So fingerprinting was the be-all, end-all. And what we're looking for are blood fingerprints, because that will seal the case of. But it was vitally important that we could identify all the outstanding prints that we couldn't eliminate from members of the family or people who would visit the house. So there was a series of elimination, which is a big job. First of all, finding all the prints, eliminating people off them. In one case, we eliminated a painter on a 20-year-old print in a bedroom window.
But the painstaking elimination of the prints was far from the only line of inquiry Mark Waters and his team were following. Scene of crime officers and detectives were also paying special attention to blood spatter patterns found where Mr. Denbury had been murdered. Blood spatter analysis is a key tool of police forensics and can help reveal information about how the victim was killed.
Bernard, in 1988, you were a detective sergeant on secondment to the Home Office Forensic Science Laboratory at Chepstow.
Yes, that's right.
When you were called, in actual fact, back to your own force in Gwent to a murder scene at Pilmar Road in Newport.
Yes, this was the bloodiest scene that I've ever visited, and I've seen quite a few, but this was contained in a house, the most blood I've ever seen.
And what, in relation to the blood pattern analysis, are you looking for?
Depending on which part of the body is injured, will depend how it bleeds. A stabbing into a vein will spurt in motion, and a fight will throw splashes of blood. And so the scientist I was with, the biologist, was looking for all that sort of thing, and most of those things were present, which gave the impression there was quite a struggle went on.
What normally causes different kinds of splashes?
Well, movement will cause it, or it depends on where the body is injured. If it's a main artery, a vein, it will spurt, or blood will run, or blood will drip, and then if the body's moved, it will throw the blood, and if it connects with something, then will splash in whichever direction it hits. Or circular pools of blood on the floor means probably someone standing still and it's just dropping down. So quite a lot can be gained from all of that, and that's what takes the time.
What did you establish from the scene, do you think, that happened that day?
I think he was dragged around the house. He was beaten in the journey, as I would say, from the living room through the corridor to the front room and up the stairs into where he died. There was no doubt he was dragged and pulled and kicked and punched, and the complete distance, I would think.
The blood spatter analysis revealed to police how brutal the attack was. It also revealed how the attack had unfolded, from the first stunning blow to the deadly last. And the killer had also left another bloody clue, a chilling piece of evidence that was meant as a deliberate warning.
He had a book opened on his head amongst the blood, and it was a book about homosexuality.
The book was perhaps the investigation's first real clue as to the motive for the crime, and an indication that Danny may have had a dual aspect to his life. It was then down to the police to start putting boots on the ground to make detailed inquiries into anyone Mr. Denry may have been associated with. I'm en route to meet Detective Kevin Price, who was an officer tasked with assisting the inquiry. Local knowledge was going to prove to be crucial to the investigation.
Kevin, in 1988, you were a young detective constable in Quince Police, where you were seconded to the murder investigation of Danny Denry. When he was found dead in a very violent death, he had a book about homosexuality, I think, on his head.
Yeah. The placing of a book on someone's face is a deliberate act. Yeah. So the significance of that could well have been an indicator in terms of where the investigation would go. When we actually followed the route that Danny would take and the places that he would visit, there became a commonality between the establishments. They were often used by people from an emerging gay and lesbian scene. And it was almost as if it was a subculture that existed in the town centre at that time, that certainly from my knowledge as a young PC in that area, I would not have known or suspected it.
And I understand you knew the Denry family.
Yeah, I knew Danny's brother, Neil Denry, because I was living in a small town just outside Newport, and he used to be the local landlord. They were a lovely family, and they were a very well-respected family in Newport, and still are a very respected family.
And they had no indication, and why would they, but they had no indication that Danny was homosexual.
They never spoke about it or commented on it, certainly to me or to people outside the family.
And indeed, Danny didn't.
No, and that's if they had the inkling. And I don't think there's anything abnormal with that. I think that's the reality of families.
But also, I think when we look back in 1988, Danny was 62 years of age. That's a whole different ball game of being, you know, gay, because there's huge amounts for a lot of people, you know, shame about sexuality and privacy and what people would think of them. There's all sorts of issues that were going around, and a man of 62 and 88, that's a long, long time ago.
Yeah, it is. And if you accept and you consider now that an individual's choice of their sexuality is with them regardless of what era they live in life, the social acceptability of that decision that creates the need to either go underground or choose venues where they're happy and comfortable with, or tell no one or tell everyone. Nowadays, thankfully, the attitudes are far greater that individuals can live their life as they feel they want to live their life without discrimination and without intimidation.
How did you manage to talk to people who may have been gay or bisexual, that would have had mistrust about the police, would have felt that if they spoke about their sexuality, it might have been hidden from their own family or partner?
Yeah. I think the reality was in a very short time we had to gain that trust. It's a live investigation. As every hour goes by, the risk of not catching that person becomes even greater, or them going and commit another offence. So we had to basically go in there and create the environment where they trusted exactly what we were saying. I mean, I've got to be honest, a police officer coming into that environment was probably not what they were expecting and probably not what they wanted. Yeah. So we had to overcome their anxieties and their concern about how they would be treated. And we probably had to overcome some of our own prejudices as well, because deliberate or otherwise, because the very nature of what was happening and its social acceptability at that time, they were different times in as much as, because you never came into contact with anyone, you didn't really know how to behave. But of course, the tensions that were apparent then had to be broken down, and we could only do that by sitting down with the people, talking with them, gaining their trust, and actually trying to put into perspective the public duty that everyone's got to try and find out who's responsible for this terrible murder.
Because if we put it in context, Kevin, about 1988, you know, the police kind of were white, male, heterosexual, and often would recruit white male heterosexuals. So there was some form of, whether it's conscious or unconscious bias about a world that they knew nothing about or even understood. So I think it's really refreshing that you're reflecting about any bias the police may have had, consciously or unconsciously. But as a detective myself, and as a gay woman myself, I'm well aware of that. So it was must have been a very difficult job for you to kind of build that trust.
You do play on people's emotions because you have to paint the picture that we don't know why the murder took place, what the victimisation was, what the driving factors were, and until we identify that individual responsible, there may be a risk to the people who frequent those locations themselves. So that is a very powerful tool to be able to persuade individuals to cooperate.
These people who had to live closeted lives often took risks, and this put them in heightened situations of danger.
As the police began to gain the trust of the local community, information slowly started flowing into the incident room. I'm heading back to see Mark Waters, who as the lead investigator had the job of building a picture of Mr. Denbury's complex life.
So Danny was a man who was homosexual, and what was his lifestyle in Newport?
Danny's used to meet people at the Austin Friars toilets. There was a pub opposite Royal Albert where he would sit. He would go down to the toilet if he saw somebody he recognised or understood to be gay, walk down behind them. He would stand in the toilet and they would exchange glances. Then Danny would leave and stand on the outside. If the guy was interested, he'd come out, stand by Danny, they'd whisper a few words to one another and they'd disappear off to wherever they were going.
So the toilet was really, from what you're saying for Danny, just a place to meet.
A meeting place, yeah. It's known as cottaging.
Yes.
And there were, as the inquiry continued, we found sort of a group of probably 100 people who used these toilets. We convinced them that contact us on a number, we gave them a separate number.
And did you get many calls?
We had a lot of calls, yes.
What kind of people were frequenting the toilets?
They were a mix. Senior Catholic priests, businessmen, one chap went round a Rolls Royce. People who had been in prison. You know, the last, quite macho guys who would never think they were doing it.
Did you establish stories from the other men that you spoke to who had suffered forms of kind of blackmail or beatings?
The one young lad said to me that he would always, when he went into a toilet, he'd always look at the shoes because he recognised the bullies, and there were a lot of them. When you look into it, you realise the dangers and the beatings and robbery that these people were putting up with, which they couldn't really go and complain about because first question would be, what was going on?
Mark Waters has revealed a world I was all too familiar with as a young cop investigating crime. But under Mark's superb stewardship, things quickly changed in Newport when the gay community saw how sensitive and supportive the police were in their inquiries. However, for all the advances being made in the investigation, the police still had no match for the prints, no witnesses to the crime, and no prime suspect. Newport, South Wales saw the murder of respected local man Danny Denbury. It was an investigation with many leads, but no prime suspect. Rare police archive footage from the era is of a press conference hosted by Detective Superintendent Mark Waters back in 1988, appealing to the public for more help.
Somebody must have seen him on the Monday night or Tuesday morning. Please contact us and use this line. The calls will be treated in the utmost confidence, and I'm hoping they will come forward and give us some assistance with this matter.
In this appeal, Mark also revealed a photo fit of a potential suspect seen near the scene. It was pieced together by information received from members of the public. But as with all photo fits, the police knew they could not place too much emphasis on it, but it was a useful tool to keep the crime at the forefront of people's minds in the hope that someone would come forward.
A man answering a similar description was again seen with Mr. Denbury outside his home at about 4 o'clock on that Monday afternoon. So we're obviously very keen to trace that man. We certainly must get this man very quickly.
With the photo fit in wide circulation and door-to-door inquiries still continuing, Mark Waters employed even more officers to examine the records held at the Fingerprint Bureau to see if there was any potential match. And after weeks of solid searching and thousands of man-hours, the team had the breakthrough that they had been looking for. All thanks to the handprint found at the scene.
It turned up a fingerprint of a guy called McGovern, who was arrested in the summer of 1987 in Monmouth. He had gone there with a young lady, stayed at a hotel. She had given him the money to pay the bill and had left. When the time came for him to leave, he ran away, and the hue and cry went up and he was arrested in Monmouth. Unfortunately, a young policeman there fingerprinted him, and that showed there was a match for his palm print for the palm print in Danny's house.
But because of your kind of professionalism and tenacity, and in doing that, it was the vital piece of evidence that you got.
Yes, we'd have always had that print. Luckily, the PC, the constable who was my namesake, Waters, out in Monmouth, took his prints. But we were pretty strict on that in Gwent for anybody comes in, chart prints, you know, because fingerprint evidence was so vital to us. They should have all been done throughout the country.
Throughout the country.
But some people didn't bother or found some reason for not doing it. But we insisted that everybody, put it this way, if his fingerprints hadn't been taken,
you'd still be
there'd
searching.
have been trouble.
And when you arrested McGovern...
Well, we then tracked him down to 3 addresses, actually. He hit 3 addresses at the same time.
The fingerprint evidence led to the apprehension of the man who quickly became the prime suspect, Paul McGovern. I'm heading back to see Kevin Price, who was one of the officers tasked with visiting Paul McGovern's house to look for further evidence.
So you were on the team that went to Paul McGovern's house and went in there to arrest him.
Yes, I was. 3 teams went simultaneously to the 3 addresses. We made a rapid entry into that premises and identified ourselves as police officers. He was actually caught behind the doors he went in.
And what was his response?
He was very calm. He was given an impression as if he was shocked. He basically said he didn't know Danny Denbury and then went very quiet.
So when he was brought back to the station, presumably you searched his flat?
Yeah, once he'd been detained and effectively taken to the police station, the senior investigating officer, Mark Waters, would have been notified. He would have then tasked a scenes of crime team, the house to be preserved as it was. That is a potential forensic goldmine if McGovern was responsible, because you'd be looking for clothing, you'd be looking for footwear, possible implements that may have been used, anything that you'd already identified as part of the investigation. You'd be looking for something that corroborated the fact that McGovern was a suspect, not only by the identification by fingerprint, but also that they had the potential other corroborative evidence would have been found at that location.
Forensic techniques have evolved enormously in the past 30 years, especially where DNA is concerned. But in regards to fingerprinting, from what I've seen in this case, I don't think the work could have been bettered. I'm going back to see Scene of Crimes Officer Alan Chown to see if he agrees.
When you looked at a crime scene in 1988 and then you would look at a crime scene much later on in 2020, for example, what are the differences?
The differences are very, very small in relation to fingerprint side of things. We still fingerprint with fingerprint powders, etc., in the same way as we would have done then. However, progress has been made throughout that time with laser examination now of scenes on difficult surfaces where before we couldn't fingerprint. Other things now are done chemically that we would retain and send away for specialist chemical analysis for fingerprints. So it has changed, in particular in relation to blood at scenes. In the old days we would have been dealing, like in this case, with blood groupings. These days we're talking about DNA evidence, and the one-touch DNA, as it's become known now, is more important now than it's ever been. As time has gone on, scenes of crime has evolved with that, and we have become far more careful about how we examine scenes now. Nobody enters or leaves a scene without a white suit on, a mask, etc., to try and protect and collect as much DNA without any chance of contamination.
Fingerprints evidence helped identify prime suspect Paul McGovern, and the time had now come to put him under the spotlight in the interview room. I'm in Newport, South Wales, re-investigating the murder of popular local man Danny Denbury. Prime suspect Paul McGovern was now off the streets and in the custody suite. It was down to Mark Waters to conduct the crucial police interviews with him. And when McGovern was sat before him, Waters was reminded of how unreliable the public's memory can be because of the photo fit. But the fingerprint made him confident they were talking to the right man.
I decided to interview him because I could see that, what I saw him originally, being arrested and what have you, that he was going to be a difficult one. I started off immediately saying, well, do you know Danny Denbury? He said, yes, I know Danny. I went to his house. We met in town. I had a couple of drinks. I said, you pay for them? He paid for them. I didn't have any money. So what was the conversation? He said, well, he had some porno books that I might be interested in, but they were at his home. And he invited me to go home with him to collect these books. So we caught the bus to Malpas, walked to his house, went into the front door. When we got in there was a man called John. So I said, look, fine, describe John. And he described John exactly to fit the identity kit that we put out. So we went through then what they did in the house, and he said that Danny couldn't find the books. So I helped him search. And I said, tell me exactly where you went in the house. And we started off in the front room, every drawer, every cupboard. We went through the kitchen, every drawer, every cupboard. We went upstairs into the bathroom, all around the bathroom, all around the bedrooms. He was going through every drawer. So I said, and this was going on for ages, really. But I made a note of keeping everywhere he went. And it was pretty clear, he knew that we'd picked him out on a fingerprint, and the fingerprint was in the house. So he had to say that he'd been there.
But he didn't know where?
But he didn't know where the fingerprint was.
Yeah.
So he'd obviously searched these places, looked for something. But then he went on to talk about John and Danny started having sex, and he then left. So I asked him where he went, and he said, I went to town, and he then went to 3 or 4 public houses, and he said he had 2 pints in each of the public houses. And then I sort of at the end said, well, you had no money, so where did you get the money from? His face dropped, and he said, well, I Danny's wallet, 100 quid in it. When John and him were having sex, I found them. So, you know, his case was starting to fall a little bit then, and we pushed on from there.
Did he ever admit it?
He never admitted it to police, but I had enough evidence to get him to trial. His girlfriend said that he'd come home very late that night. His trousers had stains on them, red stains, and his shirt had red stains. She asked him what it was. He said it was from red oxide, because she thought he was working, but he'd actually never worked in the 2 years he knew her. So she washed his clothes that night, and at his insistence, and didn't ask any more questions, really. It was a good case. I had enough to charge him, and I charged. In those days, my decision to charge will charge him.
With McGovern awaiting trial, charged with murder, out of the blue, Mark Waters received a phone call that would only serve to reinforce the case against a suspected murderer. It would also become the nearest thing the police would ever get to a confession in relation to the crime.
I had this phone call, boss, somebody wants to speak to you, it's very important. And this chap was saying, it's a Danny murder. He said, the chap you got confessed to me in prison that he killed Danny. So I said, well, we better meet. So we had a met, and he said, I knew Danny personally before I went to prison. And while I was in prison, I saw the murder, and I saw this guy, he was in remand there, and I got chatting to him. And I said to him, what about this murder that he did? And he said, oh, I did him. He said he tried to come on to me, so I wanted to kill him. And so he rang me up with that and made a statement. He gave evidence at his trial.
During the trial, it was suggested that McGovern was a repressed homosexual who had vented his anger against other gay men. But overall, the police were never really able to find many details about the man who lived a peripatetic life.
We knew he'd been in the army, and his wife they'd been to Germany together. He'd left her. He'd just drifting, basically. How he came to come to South Wales, I don't know.
Where was he from originally?
Manchester.
Manchester.
Yeah, and how he existed down here for 2 years, we've no idea. I was concerned about other crimes, clearly. We had no outstanding serious assaults, crimes involving gay people in the county, so there was nothing we could, well, put it this way, he had no complaints. We certainly didn't have any dead bodies, so what he was doing, we don't know.
McGovern was sentenced to life in prison, and in the summing up, the trial judge commended the police on a first-class investigation. I'm back visiting Detective Kevin Price, who played a pivotal role in this case. A case that became a blueprint for future murder investigations and helped Gwent Police secure an impressive number of convictions.
If there was a murder that was committed in Gwent today, do you have designated murder teams?
No, we still don't. What we have, though, is officers trained to a higher level. When I first went as a DC, the day before I could have been dealing with a shoplifter, I could have been dealing with a robbery. The day the murder comes in, you suddenly have to up your game to the level where you understand that every action that you do has an accountability that will be tested at the highest in the land.
Sure.
So back then was that you relied on the experience of those around you, the senior investigating officer, the detective sergeant, or even the detective constables that were more experienced than you were. Nowadays, the science of criminal investigation is such now that you can train specific officers for elements within criminal investigation. And I think that's where you have the upper hand nowadays, because you're not entering an environment or an investigation where you're feeling your way. The nature of the investigation now is far more precise.
And polished.
And polished, yeah, absolutely. And therefore, the likelihood of success is far greater. Because if you actually look at the number of investigations now that happen across Britain, the undetected murders are very few and far between, and yet you go back into the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the further you go back, the more undetected murders are still relevant and lying on our files.
With McGovern behind bars, I'm interested to learn how Mark Waters felt about the inquiry and justice finally being served for the victim, Danny Denbury.
It was a different inquiry in terms of getting in the gay community. But I think we handled it right. We convinced them that if they talked to us, nothing would happen. You know, we understood their concern about family, wives, etc. finding out, but we needed to have that information. Fortunately, we didn't need people to give evidence, because from what they told us, we followed it up in other ways. So we handled that well in terms of the forensic scene was carnage, because here I had a family home which is ruined. So fortunately, I managed to get some local people to come and help put it back. It took a long time and it's quite expensive to the Gwent taxpayer, but we put the house right. In terms of forensic was perfect in terms of the work they did there, finding the print, and equally the young policeman in Monmouth who took his prints at the time, because not everybody was printed, particularly for fairly minor offences, but he did the job properly, fingerprinting properly, and due to his diligence, we detected the murder.
Another thing that is very relevant is the fact today that within the police services themselves there are officers that are LGBTQI and therefore, you know, understand the culture and would be used in any investigation.
In '79 I joined the Gwent force, and I can't think of anyone that was openly gay or lesbian at that time. Had there been, then we may have been more enlightened in terms of how we engage with those communities, because of course they'd been in smaller communities. Now, as time has gone by, that we've got representative bodies within the police service, as we are within the military, and every walk of life now. So the voice can come up and shape and advise and support investigations or whichever field that you're in, because of that knowledge is actually part of the organisation knowledge.
And I can speak from my own personal experience as well. You know, to be openly gay in the police is an uncomfortable place, you know, to be. So one can understand about people not wanting to be there. And even if, like me, I was openly gay, you know, it's not as if the police service are going to come and really listen to me at that point, in the 70s or 80s, because to be perfectly frank, you know, the police service wasn't ready for that.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. When I look back to those days, there was nothing deliberate. And my own personal view now, there was probably an unconscious bias or influence rather than something that was deliberately spoken. And through time and through policing, we've looked at what they used to call institutionalised racism. Very similar in as much as there are behaviours and activities that take place that perhaps not deliberate, but can have a negative impact on trying to serve that element of the community.
Yeah.
And we had to overcome that.
But it's also, in my opinion, for what you're saying, it's about not understanding or maybe wanting to understand other cultures and beliefs. And we also have to think that when we were in the police service in the 70s and 80s, I think the police service operated on a culture of disbelief in many, many aspects, which included domestic violence, it included, you know, rape allegations. There was a culture of disbelief. It also was one that they didn't understand and didn't probably want to understand about homosexuality.
Yeah, I'm proud to say that the police service that we belong to grew in its knowledge and its ability to adapt and to make that difference, regardless of who they were dealing with.
No, and you're absolutely right, and I agree with you about that, because the world is a completely different place now than to when it was, and thank God that it is. Mark Waters and his team were proper old-fashioned detectives. He was a leader, admired by his team, who taught them tenacity, who taught them the importance of concrete detail, and taught them the importance of being organised.
As always in these cases, I'm intrigued to know what gives an individual a mind for murder. And to help answer this question, I'm turning to forensic psychologist, Dr. Julian Boone.
What is it about men who ostensibly purport to be heterosexual but have this hidden desire to have sex with another man?
Well, there are two levels to the answer. The first is that they are bisexual and they want a family, but they want to partition the other one, and they can recognise both parts of their sexuality. However, if I were assessing McGovern, I would be wanting to tease out and find out whether it's relevant here is something called reaction formation. And this is where you not only want to do something, but you just don't want to see it in yourself. So you build up a huge wall of denial that you want this, but in order to shore up that denial, you have instant dislike for the other one. Now, why I would be looking at McGovern if I were doing an assessment for him in this regard is the sequence of events that occurred. First of all, he lies and says there's a third man. They were carrying on, so I discussed it and I left. Notice we've got the sort of discussed element. But what makes me think reaction formation of a massive form has taken place is that I cannot believe when you make the acquaintance of someone in a public toilet, they get chatting, and why don't you come back to my house? I cannot believe, unless you were subnormal intellectually, I cannot see how you wouldn't know what that was going to lead to. But when the try-on came on, short order afterwards, Mr. Denbury, poor old Mr. Denbury, was trussed up like a chicken, tied to the radiator, jabbed with a potato peeler successively, struck repeatedly, and had his head kicked in. Now, you see my point about reaction formation? There's an awful lot coming out there. If this had just been a punch on the nose, get off me. I didn't come here for anything like that. Absolutely.
He could have left.
But this is overkill, and to do all that, you have to have some massive force that you're holding back, and then you can demonstrate, I'm a man, and you can walk off with a straddle in your stride, as it were.
Murder is always the search for the truth, and it involves, taking a puzzle and putting all the pieces together to find out what happened. And in the case of Danny Denbury, he lived a very secret life. People often live complicated lives and keep secrets from the family, and it's the police's job to unearth those secret aspects of people's lives. But inevitably, by taking a stranger back to his home, Danny did lose his life.